The cool stone of the floor presses against my bare feet, a grounding weight that anchors me against the drifting tide of memory. Here, in the quiet hours before the sun claims the sky, the air is still and heavy with the scent of olive oil and old parchment. I hear the distant, rhythmic lapping of the Tiber against the banks, a sound that has not changed since the Republic was young. My hand rests upon the hilt of a dagger, not in readiness, but in remembrance of the weight it once carried. The shadows in the corner of the room stretch long and thin, mimicking the figures of men I knew, men I loved, and men I was forced to strike. There is no fear in this silence, only a profound, aching clarity. The noise of the forum, the clamor of the legions, the shouts of the mob, all have receded into a soft hum, leaving only the truth of what was done and why it must be remembered. The dust motes drift lazily through the beams of light that filter through the open shutters, dancing in slow, unhurried circles above the mosaic floor. A single oil lamp flickers gently on a wooden table, its flame dancing in the still air without fear of the draught. The scent of dried lavender and old parchment fills the room, creating a sense of profound peace that wraps around the mind like a heavy wool cloak. Outside, the cicadas hum a steady, rhythmic song that seems to slow the very passage of time, stretching the afternoon into an eternal now. The bronze bust in the corner stands with a stern countenance, its features softened by the dim illumination of the dying day. Every line on the marble face suggests the weight of public duty and private sorrow that shaped a life. The artist sought to convey the gravity of a man dedicated to the Republic, capturing the veristic tradition that valued individual character over idealized beauty. This approach mirrored the rigorous intellectual discipline instilled by his upbringing, where virtue was the only good and service to the state was the highest honor. The silence of the room is absolute and heavy with the weight of centuries of history, yet it feels strangely light to the spirit. Outside the walls, the distant hum of the city fades into a gentle and rhythmic murmur, barely disturbing the sanctuary of this sacred space. The air inside feels cool and still, inviting a deep and restful contemplation of the past without the need for words or explanations. The bust seems to gaze out at the viewer with an expression of quiet and unwavering resolve, untouched by the chaos that eventually consumed the world. No sound disturbs the peace of this place where the spirit of the Republic once lived in its purest form. The light shifts imperceptibly as the sun moves. Lower in the sky beyond the courtyard walls, painting the floor in shades of gold and ochre. The room remains a sanctuary of memory and thought for those who seek to understand the cost of liberty. The cool stone of the floor presses against my bare feet, a grounding weight that anchors me against the drifting tide of memory. Here, in the quiet hours before the sun claims the sky, the air is still and heavy with the scent of olive oil and old parchment. I hear the distant, rhythmic lapping of the Tiber against the banks, a sound that has not changed since the Republic was young. My hand rests upon the hilt of a dagger, not in readiness, but in remembrance of the weight it once carried. The shadows in the corner of the room stretch long and thin, mimicking the figures of men I knew, men I loved, and men I was forced to strike. There is no fear in this silence, only a profound, aching clarity. The noise of the forum, the clamor of the legions, the shouts of the mob, all have receded into a soft hum, leaving only the truth of what was done and why it must be remembered. The cool stone of the floor presses against my bare feet, a grounding weight that anchors me against the drifting tide of memory. Here, in the quiet hours before the sun claims the sky, the air is still and heavy with the scent of olive oil and old parchment. I hear the distant, rhythmic lapping of the Tiber against the banks, a sound that has not changed since the Republic was young. My hand rests upon the hilt of a dagger, not in readiness, but in remembrance of the weight it once carried. The shadows in the corner of the room stretch long and thin, mimicking the figures of men the cool stone of the floor presses against my bare feet, a grounding weight that anchors me against the drifting tide of memory. Here, in the quiet hours before the sun claims the sky, the air is still and heavy with the scent of olive oil and old parchment. I hear the distant, rhythmic lapping of the Tiber against the banks, a sound that has not changed since the Republic was young. My hand rests upon the hilt of a dagger, not in readiness, but in remembrance of the weight it once carried. The shadows in the corner of the room stretch long and thin, mimicking the figures of men I knew, men I loved, and men I was forced to strike. There is no fear in this silence, only a profound, aching clarity. The noise of the forum, the clamor of the legions, the shouts of the mob, all have receded into a soft hum, leaving only the truth of what was done and why it must be remembered. My earliest memories are not of play or childish games, but of the solemn weight of lineage and the heavy gaze of history. I was born into a house that claimed descent from the very founders of Rome, from Lucius Junius Brutus, who drove out the last king. That name was a burden and a shield, a constant reminder that liberty was not a gift, but a duty to be defended with blood. My father died when I was young, leaving me under the guardianship of my uncle, Cato the Younger. He was a man of iron will and unyielding principle, a Stoic who believed that virtue was the only good. Under his roof, I learned that a man's character was measured not by his wealth or his rank, but by his adherence to the law and his service to the Republic. The streets of Rome were alive with the tension of a city stretching beyond its bounds. The old ways were fraying, and new men rose with ambition that threatened to swallow the ancient laws whole. I watched these changes with wide eyes, feeling the vibration of the ground beneath my feet as the foundations of my world began to shift. The house was filled with the smell of beeswax and drying herbs, a scent that clung to the heavy woolen robes of the scholars who came to teach. Cato spoke little, but his silence was loud with meaning. He taught me to read the stars and to listen to the wind, for both held secrets of the future. I spent my days walking the gardens, where the cypress trees stood like silent sentinels, their dark needles scratching at the pale sky. The soil was rich and dark, turned over by the hands of slaves who moved with a rhythm that seemed to mimic the turning of the earth itself. I learned that power was a fragile thing, easily broken by a single careless word or a moment of hesitation. The lessons were hard, often painful, but they forged a steel within me that would not bend when the time came. I remember the taste of bitter wine at dinner, served in clay cups that felt rough against my lips. The conversations were serious, filled with debates about justice and the nature of tyranny. These words sank deep into my mind, taking root like seeds in the fertile soil of youth. Time moved slowly in those days, marked not by the ticking of clocks, but by the slow arc of the sun across the courtyard walls. The light shifted from gold to amber, then to a deep, bruised purple as evening fell. I would sit for hours on the stone steps, watching the dust motes dance in the beams of light that filtered through the open shutters. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the city. It was a time of learning, of absorbing the wisdom of the past, to prepare for the storms of the future. The world felt vast and full of possibility, yet also heavy with the weight of expectation. Every step I took was measured, every word chosen with care. The path of a Roman was narrow and steep, requiring constant vigilance and unwavering resolve. The Roman world was a tapestry of colors and sounds, woven from the threads of 1,000 different lives. I walked through the crowded markets where the air was thick with the smell of spices and roasting meat. The noise of the crowd was a constant roar, a living thing that pulsed with energy and danger. I saw the faces of men, women from every corner of the known world, their eyes reflecting the hopes and fears of their homelands. The streets were paved with stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Each stone held a story, a memory of a life lived and lost. I learned to navigate this chaos with a calm demeanor, observing the patterns of movement and the subtle shifts in the mood of the crowd. It was a school of its own, teaching me the art of reading people and understanding the hidden currents that drove them. The library was a sanctuary of silence, a place where the only sound was the turning of pages and the scratch of a stylus on wax. The shelves were lined with scrolls of papyrus, their edges frayed from years of use. The air inside was cool and dry, preserving the knowledge of the ages in the dim light. I spent many hours there, lost in the words of philosophers and historians, seeking answers to the questions that troubled my young mind. The text spoke of great men and great deeds, of battles fought and cities destroyed. They spoke of the rise and fall of empires, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos. These stories became my companions, guiding me through the complexities of the world and shaping my understanding of my place within it. I felt a deep connection to the past, a sense that I was part of a long and unbroken chain of history. One specific detail remains clear in my mind from those early years, a fact that has stayed with me through all the years since. The papyrus scrolls I studied were made from the stems of the cyperus papyrus plant, which grew in the marshes of the Nile Delta, and the process of making them involved layering strips of the plant stem in a crisscross pattern before pressing them into a single sheet. This simple fact of construction seemed insignificant at the time, yet it represented the fragility of knowledge itself. How something so delicate could hold the weight of the world. I would run my fingers over the rough surface of the paper, feeling the texture of the plant fibers, and wonder at the ingenuity of the hands that had made it. The knowledge was precious, a treasure to be guarded and passed down. The days grew shorter as the seasons turned, and the air grew cooler with the approach of winter. The gardens were quiet, the birds had migrated, and the trees stood bare against the gray sky. The silence of the house was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. I would sit by the flames, watching the sparks rise and disappear into the darkness, feeling a sense of peace that I had not known before. The fire was a symbol of hope, a light in the midst of the cold and the dark. It reminded me that even in the hardest times, there was warmth to be found, a spark of life that could not be extinguished. The lessons of Cato echoed in my mind, a steady voice guiding me through the uncertainty of the future. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but I also knew that I was prepared for whatever came. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls, and the night settled in around me, a heavy blanket of silence. The house held the memories of a life lived with honor and deep conviction, a life that had been shaped by the lessons of the past and the challenges of the present. The stone walls were cool to the touch, but they offered a sense of security, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world outside. The wind whispered softly against the shutters, a gentle reminder of the forces that shaped the lives of men. The night was deep and peaceful, wrapping the land in a soft embrace. The silence was absolute and complete, offering a deep and lasting rest. The shadows remained still as the night deepened into its quietest hour. The lamp burned on, a small beacon of light in the vast darkness. The room held the memory of a life lived with honor and deep conviction. The cool stone of the floor presses against my bare feet, a grounding weight that anchors me against the drifting tide of memory. Here, in the quiet hours before the sun claims the sky, the air is still and heavy with the scent of olive oil and old parchment. I hear the distant, rhythmic lapping of the Tiber against the banks, a sound that has not changed since the Republic was young. My hand rests upon the hilt of a dagger, not in readiness, but in remembrance of the weight it once carried. The shadows in the corner of the room stretch long and thin, mimicking the figures of men I knew, men I loved, and men I was forced to strike. There is no fear in this silence, only a profound, aching clarity. The noise of the forum, the clamor of the legions, the shouts of the mob, all have receded into a soft hum, leaving only the truth of what was done and why it must be remembered. My earliest memories are not of play or childish games, but of the solemn weight of lineage and the heavy gaze of history. I was born into a house that claimed descent from the very founders of Rome, from Lucius Junius Brutus, who drove out the last king. That name was a burden and a shield, a constant reminder that liberty was not a gift, but a duty to be defended with blood. My father died when I was young, leaving me under the guardianship of my uncle, Cato the Younger. He was a man of iron will and unyielding principle, a stoic who believed that virtue was the only good. Under his roof, I learned that a man's character was measured not by his wealth or his rank, but by his adherence to the law and his service to the Republic. The streets of Rome were alive with the tension of a city stretching beyond its bounds. The old ways were fraying, and new men rose with armies that cared little for the Senate. The relationship with my mother, Servilia, was a complex tapestry woven with threads of deep affection and painful betrayal. She was the sister of Cato, a woman of sharp intellect and formidable will, yet she became the lover of Julius Caesar. This bond created a chasm within our family that no amount of diplomacy could bridge. I watched as the man who had been my mother's companion grew into the dictator who threatened the very soul of the state. The conflict tore at me, a private sorrow that demanded a public resolution. I chose the path of the Republic, even when it meant standing against the man who had forgiven my past opposition and treated me with surprising clemency. In 49 BCE, I led a fleet at the siege of Massilia, a grim duty that required me to fight against Caesar's forces. The sea was rough that year, and the salt spray stung my eyes as I commanded the ships. It was a necessary action, a demonstration of my commitment to the senatorial cause against the rising tide of autocracy. Caesar eventually forgave me, a gesture that complicated my internal struggle when his power grew unchecked. He designated me for a consulship in 42 BC and named me as one of his heirs, trusting me with his legacy. This trust weighed heavily on my conscience as the days grew shorter and the shadows of tyranny lengthened across the city. The shock came in early 44 BCE when Caesar made himself perpetual dictator. The deification of a mortal man violated the republican ideals I had cherished since childhood. The concentration of power in one hand meant the end of our shared governance. I saw the future unfolding, a dark path where the Senate would become a mere formality and the people would lose their voice forever. The relationship with Cassius became central to the plot that would change everything. He was a man of sharp edges and deep resolve, a collaborator who shared my belief that tyranny must be stopped by any means necessary. Our partnership was forged in the quiet spaces between the noise of the city, where we discussed the moral arguments that justified the coming act. We spoke of Cato, of the laws, of the sacred duty to protect the Republic. The collaboration transformed a private grievance into a public act of regicide. Cassius acted as the primary architect of the conspiracy, but I lent my name to the cause, giving it the weight of my lineage. We were not driven by hatred, but by a desperate love for the freedom we feared was slipping away. My daily existence was filled with debate and reflection, often in the company of Empilus, a rhetorician and housemate who wrote an account of the assassination. He was a trusted companion, a man who understood the burden I carried. These conversations reinforced the moral arguments that justified our actions. The presence of such a housemate suggests a domestic life filled with intellectual camaraderie, a refuge from the pressures of political life. We sat in the quiet study, the scent of beeswax and old papyrus filling the small, enclosed space. A single oil lamp cast a soft, flickering glow across the marble floor of the modest room. Dust motes danced slowly in the warm light, suspended in the stillness of the evening air. A scroll of Greek philosophy lay open on the wooden desk, its edges worn from frequent handling. Outside the window, the distant sounds of the city had faded into a gentle, rhythmic hum. The shadows of the olive trees in the courtyard swayed slightly in the cool night breeze. This peaceful setting offered a brief respite from the turmoil that had defined my public existence. The silence of the room seemed to hold the weight of my many choices and their consequences. The Roman world in the early 1st century BCE existed within a fragile political atmosphere that slowly eroded traditional republican norms. I lived during a time when the Senate struggled to maintain authority over powerful military commanders. The faction of the Optimates was my home, a choice that placed me in direct opposition to the man who had been close to my own family. After the assassination in March 44 BC, I left Rome to occupy Cisalpine Gaul, which had been assigned to me by Caesar. I sought to establish a secure base from which to defend the ideals I held dear. The Senate granted me command against Mark. Antony after Antony besieged me at Mutina. This military appointment reflected the complex political alliances that formed in the chaotic years after the Ides of March. I moved through the provinces, trying to rally support, trying to hold the line against the forces of Antony and Octavian. The sun dipped low over the marble colonnades of a quiet Roman villa, casting long, soft shadows across the polished stone floor. A single oil lamp flickered gently on a wooden table, its flame dancing in the still air. The scent of dried lavender and old parchment filled the room, creating a sense of profound peace. Outside, the cicadas hummed a steady, rhythmic song that seemed to slow the very passage of time. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of light that filtered through the open shutters. A bronze bust of a stern statesman stood in the corner, its features softened by the dim illumination. The silence was deep and heavy, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the garden. This quiet space offered a sanctuary from the turmoil of the world outside, inviting the mind to rest. The cool stone walls held the warmth of the day, providing a comforting embrace for the weary traveler. My soldiers deserted me for Octavian while I was pursuing Antony into Gallia Narbonensis. This loss of support signaled the inevitable collapse of my cause and the rise of imperial rule. The Battle of Philippi sealed the fate of the Republican faction and their leader. The final military engagement marked the end of our struggle against the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian. We fought alongside each other, Cassius and I, in the hope that our cause could be saved. The defeat at Philippi was a tragedy that ended the lives of the leaders of the Republic. The story of Brutus remains a cautionary tale about the costs of political idealism. Historical accounts of Brutus vary widely depending on the perspective of the writer and the era in which they lived. Some ancient authors portrayed me as a noble hero who sacrificed my life for the freedom of my country. Others depicted me as a treacherous murderer who destroyed the stability of the Roman state. The few letters that survive show a man of intelligence and deep feeling who was torn by conflicting loyalties. My life ended in tragedy on the fields of Philippi. Far from the city I sought to save. The historical record preserves my name, even if it cannot preserve my voice. The bust in the Prado and the fragments of my letters are all that remain of my physical and intellectual presence. These remnants invite quiet reflection on the nature of power and the fragility of liberty. The past continues to speak through these silent artifacts and the few surviving words of my correspondence. The silence of my own pen contrasts with the enduring noise of my reputation. I see now that the choice was never easy, and the path was never clear. The weight of the decision remains, a stone in the pocket of memory that never wears smooth. One surprising fact remains clear in my mind, a detail often overlooked by those who seek to judge. The Roman calendar was so confused by the time of Caesar's death that the year 46 BCE had 445 days, a chaotic adjustment known as the Year of Confusion, that was necessary to realign the solar year before the Julian reform could take full effect. This administrative chaos mirrored the political chaos that consumed us all. The days blurred into nights, and the years lost their meaning as the Republic crumbled. I remember the confusion of the soldiers, the uncertainty of the laws, the sense that the very structure of time was breaking down. It was a fitting backdrop for the end of an era. The world was changing, and there was no going back. The Republic was gone, replaced by the empire that would shape the world for centuries. I accept this outcome with a quiet heart, knowing that I did what I believed was right. The cost was high, but the duty was clear. The cool stone of the floor presses against my bare feet, a grounding weight that anchors me against the drifting tide of memory. Here, in the quiet hours before the sun claims the sky, the scent of olive oil and old parchment, rhythmic lapping of the Tiber against the banks, a sound that has not changed since the Republic was young. My hand rests upon the hilt of a dagger, not in readiness, but in remembrance of the weight it once carried. The shadows in the corner of the room stretch long and thin, mimicking the figures of men I knew, men I loved, and men I was forced to strike. There is no fear in this silence, only a profound, aching clarity. The noise of the forum, the clamor of the legions, the shouts of the mob, all have receded into a soft hum, leaving only the truth of what was done and why it must be remembered. The path from the boy who watched his father fall to the man who held the knife was paved with the quiet lessons of a stoic upbringing. My uncle Cato taught me that the world outside was a storm, but the mind could remain a still harbor if one learned to anchor itself in reason. He did not speak of glory or fame, for those were fickle things that vanished with the wind. Instead, he spoke of duty, of the invisible threads that bind a citizen to the state, and of the terrible cost of breaking those threads. I walked the same cobblestones he walked, feeling the rough grain of the stone beneath my sandals, listening to the arguments that swirled in the porticos like dust motes in a sunbeam. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and unwashed bodies, a sensory tapestry of a city that had grown too large for its own laws. I saw the great men of the day, their faces worn by the weight of office, their eyes tired from the endless struggle to maintain order. They were not gods, but men, just as I was a man. And this realization was the first step toward the heavy burden I would eventually carry. The philosophy I embraced was not a theory to be debated in the cool halls of the academy, but a way of breathing, a method of walking through a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. It demanded that I accept what could not be changed and act with courage on what could. The teachings of Zeno and Chrysippus were not merely words on a scroll, but a rhythm I learned to match with my own heartbeat. When the chaos of the city threatened to overwhelm my senses, I retreated into the inner citadel of my mind, finding a space where the noise could not reach. This mental sanctuary was built from the memories of my father's death and the stern, unblinking gaze of my uncle. It was a place of cold clarity where the emotions of the moment were examined like stones on a beach, turned over and inspected until their true nature was revealed. The fear of death, the desire for power, the sting of betrayal, these were all just waves crashing against the shore. And I learned to stand firm while they rose and fell. As the years passed, the political landscape shifted beneath my feet, turning from solid ground into a treacherous swamp. The rise of Caesar was a slow, deliberate tide that threatened to swallow the old Constitution whole. I watched him walk through the streets, his head held high, his face a mask of calculated benevolence that hid the ambition burning within. The people cheered for him, but I saw the chains he was forging for them, invisible and heavy. The Senate became a theater of whispers and backroom deals, where the laws were bent until they snapped. I felt the tension in the air, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up before the storm broke. The values I had been raised to cherish were being eroded, replaced by the cult of the one man who claimed to know better. The decision to act did not come in a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, grinding realization that inaction was itself a choice with its own terrible consequences. The night before the Ides of March, the moon hung low and pale over the city, casting long, distorted shadows across the forum. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of rain that never fell. I sat in my room, the wax of the oil lamp melting slowly in its dish, watching the flame dance and flicker. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant barking of a dog and the creaking of the wooden shutters in the breeze. My mind wandered back to the lessons of my youth, to the stories of Lucius Junius Brutus who drove out the kings, and to the weight of the name I carried. The face of Caesar appeared in the darkness, not as a tyrant, but as a friend, a brother, a man I had loved. The conflict tore at me, a physical pain in the chest that made breathing difficult. Duty and love were at war, and the only way to resolve the struggle was to sever the tie that bound us. The knife lay on the table, cold and heavy, its edge gleaming in the dim light. It was an instrument of death, but also an instrument of liberation, a tool to restore the balance that had been lost. The morning of the assassination was bright and clear, the sky a brilliant, unblemished blue. The sun warmed the marble columns of the Senate House, making them glow with a golden light. The air smelled of dust and the sweat of men gathering for the day's business. I walked among them, my heart beating a steady, slow rhythm against my ribs. The faces of my co-conspirators were masks of calm, but I could see the tension in their jaws, the slight tremor in their hands. We moved as one, a single entity driven by a shared purpose that transcended our individual fears. The moment of the strike was not a moment of violence, but a moment of terrible necessity. A surgical cut to remove a tumor that threatened the body of the state. The blood was warm and wet, a stark contrast to the cold stone of the floor. The shock of the deed was immediate, a sudden silence that fell over the room, as if the air itself had been sucked away. The screams of the others, the confusion, the chaos, all of it faded into a distant hum, leaving only the stillness of the act and the weight of what had been done. In the days that followed, the city descended into a frenzy of grief and rage. The body of Caesar lay in the Forum, a broken monument to a dream that had died. The people wept, their faces streaked with tears and soot, their voices rising in a chorus of lamentation. I stood apart from the crowd, feeling the weight of their hatred, like a physical pressure against my skin. The air was thick with the smoke of burning scrolls and the scent of fear. The republic I had fought to save seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a mob that demanded vengeance rather than justice. The Senate granted me command against Mark Antony, a desperate attempt to restore order to the chaos. The journey to Mutina was a long and arduous trek through the countryside, the landscape changing from the rolling hills of Latium to the rugged terrain of the north. The roads were muddy and difficult, the wheels of the carriage sinking deep into the soft earth with every turn. The soldiers marched in silence, their faces set in grim determination, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The siege of Mutina was a test of endurance and resolve. The cold winds of the north cut through my cloak, biting at my skin with a sharpness that numbed the body. The nights were long and dark, the campfires casting flickering shadows against the tents. The sound of the wind howling through the valleys was a constant reminder of the isolation we faced. Yet, in those quiet moments, the philosophy that had guided me through the storm held firm. The external circumstances did not matter, only the integrity of the spirit. I walked the ramparts, the rough stone rough against my palms, feeling the solidity of the walls that protected us. The stars above were bright and clear, a vast canopy of light that seemed to stretch across the entire sky. The silence of the night was broken only by the distant cry of an owl and the soft rustle of the guards shifting their positions. The world outside was a place of chaos and conflict. But here, in the stillness of the camp, there was a sense of peace that could not be shaken. The legacy of these events was carved into the very fabric of history, a testament to the enduring struggle between liberty and tyranny. The busts that were made in my image captured not the man I was, but the ideal I represented. The stone was rough and unpolished, reflecting the harsh realities of the political terrain I had navigated. The lines around the eyes were deep, etched by years of worry and contemplation. The jaw was set in a firm, unyielding manner, a visual representation of the stoic resolve that had defined my life. The artist had avoided the softening effects of idealization, choosing instead to present a man who was human and real, with all the imperfections that such a life entailed. The technique used was one of careful observation, capturing the subtle expressions that revealed the depth of a person's convictions. The influence of Cato was evident. In the unyielding nature of these representations, a visual extension of the lessons learned in the halls of the Senate, the cool stone of the floor presses against my bare feet, a grounding weight that anchors me against the drifting tide of memory. Here, in the quiet hours before the sun claims the sky, the air is still and heavy with the scent of olive oil and old parchment. I hear the distant rhythmic lapping of the Tiber against the banks, a sound that has not changed since the Republic was young. My hand rests upon the hilt of a dagger, not in readiness, but in remembrance of the weight it once carried. The shadows in the corner of the room stretch long and thin, mimicking the figures of men I knew, men I loved, and men I was forced to strike. There is no fear in this silence, only a profound, aching clarity. The noise of the forum, the clamor of the legions, the shouts of the mob, all have receded into a soft hum, leaving only the truth of what was done and why it must be remembered. I recall the days when the air inside my own home felt thick with the smoke of debate and the dust of rolling scrolls. Empilus, my housemate and a man of sharp tongue and softer heart, would sit across from me by the fading light. He was a rhetorician who knew how to shape words into weapons or shields, depending on the need of the hour. We spoke often of the great man who sat at the center of our world, the one who held the fate of Rome in his hands. Empilus wrote down our conversations, our fears, and our justifications in a text he titled Brutus. He captured the planning of the Ides with a precision that no other contemporary could match. That manuscript is lost now, swallowed by the ravages of time and the indifference of centuries. Only the memory of his voice remains, a ghost in the quiet of this room. The planning was not a sudden burst of madness, but a slow, deliberate weaving of threads. We gathered in the shadows of porticos and the quiet corners of libraries, speaking in hushed tones that barely disturbed, the dust motes dancing in the light. The conspiracy was born of necessity, not malice, though the world would later paint it as a crime of passion. We felt the weight of a crown being placed upon a head that should have known the limits of power. The Republic was a fragile thing, like a glass vessel held too tightly by trembling hands. Every day we watched it crack a little, more under the pressure of one man's ambition. My mother, Servilia, had once loved that man, and the bond she shared with him made my own choice all the more difficult. To strike him was to sever a family tie that had stretched back through generations of intimacy and trust. Caito, my uncle, stood as the moral compass that guided my steps even after his death. His stoic face appeared in my mind whenever the path grew dark. He taught me that a man must act according to his principles, regardless of the personal cost. That lesson was etched into my soul as deeply as the lines on an old map. Cassius was the spark that lit the fire, but it was the collective will of the Senate that fueled it. We were a group of men bound by a shared belief that tyranny must be stopped before it consumed everything. The collaboration was not easy, for it required us to betray a friend, a leader, and a man who had shown us clemency. Yet, the silence of the Republic was louder than the voice of any single dictator. The morning of the Ides arrived with a sky that was unnaturally clear and a light that seemed too bright for such a heavy day. The air smelled of rain that never fell, carrying the scent of whetstone and anticipation. I walked through the streets of Rome, feeling the eyes of the crowd upon me, though I knew they did not yet understand what was coming. The Senate House stood like a fortress of marble and shadow, its columns rising high against the blue expanse. Inside, the air was cool and still, a stark contrast to the heat of the outside world. We moved toward the center of the room, our footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The moment of action was not chaotic frenzy, but a series of deliberate, measured movements. Each blow was struck with the weight of a lifetime of hesitation behind it. The blood that fell was not just the blood of a man, but the blood of an era that was ending. The silence that followed the act was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the sound from the room. For a heartbeat there was no noise, no breath, only the stillness of a world holding its breath. Then the shouts began, the confusion, the panic of a city waking to a new reality. I remember looking down at my hands, stained with the red proof of what we had done. There was no triumph in that moment, only a terrible, hollow certainty. We had saved the Republic from a king, but we had not saved ourselves from the consequences. The path forward was obscured by the smoke of uncertainty, and the future was a blank page waiting to be written in ink and blood. The days that followed were a blur of movement and evasion. I left Rome to find a place where the ideals we had fought for could take root again. Cisalpine Gaul became our sanctuary, a region of green fields and rolling hills that offered a temporary respite from the chaos of the capital. The soldiers I led were men who believed in the cause, men who had chosen liberty over the comfort of a master. We marched through the countryside, the wind in our hair and the weight of our purpose in our hearts. Yet, the shadow of Antony and Octavian loomed large, a storm gathering on the horizon that threatened to wash us away. The alliances of the past were fracturing, and the loyalties of the present were shifting like sand in the wind. Empilus continued to write, documenting the aftermath with the same precision he had applied to the planning. He described the reactions of the people, the fear in the eyes of the senators, and the hope that flickered briefly in the hearts of the common folk. His words were a testament to the fact that we had acted with intention, not in the heat of the moment, but with the cold clarity of reason. The loss of his text is a sorrow that I carry with me into the silence of death. It is a gap in the story of my life, a missing piece of the puzzle that will never be found. The world knows of the Ides through the accounts of others, through the biases of those who came after, but the true voice of that time is gone. The sun dipped low over the marble colonnades of a quiet Roman villa, casting long, soft shadows across the polished stone floor. A single oil lamp flickered gently on a wooden table, its flame dancing in the still air. The scent of dried lavender and old parchment filled the room, creating a sense of profound peace. Outside, the cicadas hummed a steady, rhythmic song that seemed to slow the very passage of time. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of light that filtered through the open shutters. A bronze bust of a stern statesman stood in the corner, its features softened by the dim illumination. The silence was deep and heavy, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the garden. This quiet space offered a sanctuary from the turmoil of the world outside, inviting the mind to rest. The cool stone walls held the warmth of the day, providing a comforting embrace for the weary traveler. The Battle of Philippi was the final chapter in this long and tragic story. The fields of Macedonia were wet with the dew of a cold morning, and the air was thick with the smell of iron and blood. We stood against the forces of Antony and Octavian, a small band of republicans facing the tide of empire. The clash was brutal and unrelenting, a storm of steel and shouting that tore through the ranks. My soldiers, once so loyal, began to desert, their faith shaken by the sheer weight of the opposition. The loss of support was a slow erosion, a crumbling of the foundation upon which we had built our hope. The defeat was inevitable, a fate that had been written in the stars long before we drew our swords. In those final moments, I felt a strange sense of calm, a detachment from the pain and the loss. The noise of the battle faded into a distant roar, and the world narrowed down to the simple act of breathing. The legacy of my life would be defined by this one act, this single moment of violence that ended the life of a dictator. The silence of my own pen contrasts with the enduring noise of my reputation. History remembers me as a hero or a traitor, depending on the angle from which the story is told. The truth is far more complex, a tapestry of conflicting loyalties and impossible choices. The web of obligations that bound me to my family and my country was a knot that could not be untied without cutting the thread. The years that passed after Philippi were a time of quiet reflection, a slow winding down of the spirit. I walked through the gardens of the villa, watching the seasons change and the leaves turn from green to gold to brown. The scent of the earth was rich and deep, a reminder of the cycle of life and death that governs all things. I thought often of Empilus and the words he wrote, the words that were now lost to the winds of time. The fact that a single word in the Greek language can have multiple meanings, depending on its accent, is a small reminder of how easily history can be misinterpreted. The accent of the past is often lost, leaving only the flat, uninflected text for us to decipher. The legacy of the conspiracy is not one of glory but of sorrow. We sought to preserve a way of life that was already slipping through our fingers like water. The Republic was a dream that could not survive the reality of power. The men I fought beside are now dust, their names forgotten or twisted by the hands of time. The only thing that remains is the memory of the choice we made, the choice to act when the world demanded inaction. It was a choice that cost us everything, yet it was the only choice that honored the principles we held dear. The silence of the grave is the only place where the truth can be spoken without fear of contradiction. The night deepens, and the light of the lamp grows dimmer. The shadows stretch longer, reaching out to touch the edges of the room. The scent of lavender fades, replaced by the cool, metallic smell of the coming dawn. The cicadas have stopped their song, and the world is once again silent. I close my eyes and let the darkness take me, carrying the weight of the past into the peace of the future. The story is finished, the page is turned, and the ink is dry. There is nothing left to say, only the quiet acceptance of what has been done and what must be. The journey ends here, in the stillness of the night, with the memory of a world that was and the hope of a world that might be. The cool stone of the floor presses against my bare feet, a grounding weight that anchors me against the drifting tide of memory. The air inside the room smells faintly of parchment and dried herbs, a scent that has lingered there for decades. Outside the window, the landscape stretches out in shades of green and gold under the late afternoon sun, calm and undisturbed by the coming storm. Shadows lengthen across the floor as the sun begins to set, casting long, gentle lines that move slowly with the passing of time. No sound disturbs the peace of this place except for the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze that drifts through the open window. I remember the first time I stood before the legions at Massilia, the salt spray stinging my eyes while the wooden hulls of our ships creaked under the weight of the blockade. That siege was a test of patience rather than a clash of steel, a slow strangulation of a city that refused to yield to the rising tide of one man's ambition. My fleet moved with a deliberate rhythm, each ship finding its place in the line as the sun climbed higher and the heat began to shimmer above the water. I watched the defenders on the walls, their faces pale and drawn, knowing that their resistance was a matter of days rather than years. The strategic discipline required to maintain such a blockade was a lesson in itself, teaching me that the most powerful weapon was often the silence of an approaching army. The war that followed the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE led to the final destruction of those who favored the old republican constitution of Rome. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet as the alliances of the past dissolved into a chaotic web of new loyalties and old grudges. The Senate granted me command against Mark Antony after he besieged me at Mutina, a decision that reflected the complex political maneuvers of those turbulent years. I marched north with a heart full of hope, believing that the old ways could still be restored if the right men stood together. The landscape of Cisalpine Gaul stretched out before me, a vast expanse of green fields and rolling hills that seemed to promise a future of peace. I sought to establish a secure base from which to defend the ideals I held dear, gathering soldiers and supplies with a quiet determination. My soldiers, however, began to look toward Octavian with a longing that I could not match. They saw in the young man a promise of stability, a return to order that my cause could no longer guarantee. This loss of support signaled the inevitable collapse of my cause and the rise of imperial rule, a slow and steady erosion of the republic I had tried to save. The sun dipped low over the marble colonnades of a quiet Roman villa, casting long, soft shadows across the polished stone floor. A single oil lamp flickered gently on a wooden table, its flame dancing in the still air. The scent of dried lavender and old parchment filled the room, creating a sense of profound peace. Outside, the cicadas hummed a steady, rhythmic song that seemed to slow the very passage of time. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of light that filtered through the open shutters. A bronze bust of a stern statesman stood in the corner, its features softened by the dim illumination. The silence was deep and heavy, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the garden. This quiet space offered a sanctuary from the turmoil of the world outside, inviting the mind to rest. The cool stone walls held the warmth of the day, providing a comforting embrace for the weary traveler. I sat in this stillness, thinking of the long road that had brought me here, from the halls of the Senate to the battlefields of the North. The weight of history was felt without the noise of conflict or the chaos of war, allowing the mind to wander back to the days of youth and the hopes that had once filled the heart with purpose. Historical accounts of my life vary widely depending on the perspective of the writer and the era in which they lived. Some ancient authors portrayed me as a noble hero who sacrificed my life for the freedom of my country. Others depicted me as a treacherous murderer who destroyed the stability of the Roman state. I have seen my name written in the dust of the Forum and carved into the stone of the temples, each version a reflection of the fears and hopes of those who wrote them. My actions were viewed by some as a necessary defense of liberty against tyranny, a final stand for the principles that had built the Republic. Yet others saw my deeds as a tragic betrayal of a beloved leader, a moment of madness that plunged the world into darkness. The truth lies somewhere in the quiet spaces between these extremes, in the choices made and the consequences that followed. I remember the day I left Rome to occupy Cisalpine Gaul, which had been assigned to me by Caesar himself. The city gates closed behind me with a heavy thud, sealing my fate and the fate of the Republic. I walked through the streets of the province, feeling the eyes of the people upon me, wondering if they saw a liberator or a usurper. The Battle of Philippi sealed the fate of the Republican faction and their leader. The sun rose over the plains of Macedonia, painting the sky in hues of orange and red that mirrored the blood that would soon be spilled. Our camp was a hive of activity, soldiers sharpening their swords and checking their armor, their faces set in grim determination. I walked among them, feeling the weight of their expectations and the burden of their trust. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of iron, a scent that would become the perfume of my final days. We dug trenches and built fortifications, preparing for a war that we knew we might not survive. The enemy camp lay just beyond the hills, a dark mass of men and machines that seemed to stretch to the horizon. I looked out at the landscape, thinking of the vastness of the world and the smallness of our struggle. The history of Rome was written in the blood of men like us, men who believed that their actions could change the course of time. The silence of my own pen stands in stark contrast to the loud noise of the historical events I helped shape. I wrote letters and speeches trying to articulate the reasons for my actions, but the words often felt inadequate against the reality of the war. The literary world of the 1st century BC produced a work titled Brutus. Yet this text was not authored by me. The text was written by Cicero, a man who knew me well and who saw in me a symbol of the ideals he cherished. This dialogue was written by the famous orator and served as a history of Roman eloquence. The work is named after me because I appear as a character within the dialogue rather than as its creator. Cicero, in Brutus, implicitly gives his own description of his equipment as an orator: a thorough knowledge of literature, a grounding in philosophy, and a deep understanding of the law. This fictionalized conversation allowed Cicero to explore the nature of rhetoric and the role of the orator in society. I am present only as a listener and a participant in the philosophical exchange, a silent figure in a world of words. The order that Caesar gave his officers to spare me during the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC and take me prisoner if I surrendered highlights the complex personal relationship between the dictator and his future assassin. That order suggests that Caesar viewed me as a man of principle rather than a mere political rival. Such a gesture of clemency would later be remembered as a tragic irony by subsequent generations of historians. I remember the moment I first heard of that order, a strange mix of gratitude and shame filling my heart. It was a reminder that even in the midst of war, there were bonds that could not be broken, ties of blood and friendship that defied the logic of politics. I have often wondered what would have happened if I had accepted that offer, if I had laid down my arms and returned to Rome as a prisoner of war. The path not taken is a ghost that haunts my memories, a shadow that follows me through the halls of my mind. The war that followed the assassination was a long and difficult struggle for the Roman Republic. The conflict effectively ended the hopes of restoring the traditional balance of power within the state. I became a symbol of Republican values due to my opposition to Caesar's supreme power. My actions were viewed by some as a necessary defense of liberty against tyranny. Yet others saw my deeds as a tragic betrayal of a beloved leader. The Senate granted me command against Mark. Antony after Antony besieged me at Mutina. This military appointment reflected the complex political alliances that formed in the chaotic years after the Ides of March. After the assassination in March 44 BC, I left Rome to occupy Cisalpine Gaul, which had been assigned to me by Caesar. I sought to establish a secure base from which to defend the ideals I held dear. My soldiers deserted me for Octavian while I was pursuing Antony into Gallia Narbonensis. This loss of support signaled the inevitable collapse of my cause and the rise of imperial rule. The Battle of Philippi was the end of the road. The sun dipped low over the marble colonnades of a quiet Roman villa, casting long, soft shadows across the polished stone floor. A single oil lamp flickered gently on a wooden. The cool stone of the floor presses against my bare feet, a grounding weight that anchors me against the drifting tide of memory. The air in this final room is still, heavy with the scent of dried lavender and old parchment. I watch the dust motes drift lazily through the beams of light that filter through the open shutters. My hand rests upon the hilt of a dagger, not in readiness, but in remembrance of the weight it once carried. The shadows in the corner of the room stretch long and thin, mimicking the figures of men I knew, men I loved, and men I was forced to strike. There is no fear in this silence, only a profound, aching clarity. The noise of the forum, the clamor of the legions, the shouts of the mob, all have receded into a soft hum, leaving only the truth of what was done and why it must be remembered. The world outside has changed, yet the stone walls remain steady and unchanging. The political atmosphere of Rome in those early years of the first century was fragile, like glass held too tightly in a shaking hand. The Republic relied on a system of checks and balances that slowly eroded under the pressure of powerful men with vast private armies. I lived through a time when the Senate struggled to maintain authority over commanders who answered to no one but themselves. Loyalty to the state often clashed with personal obligations to influential patrons who held the fate of the city in their hands. The shift began when a man I once called friend declared himself perpetual dictator. That appointment marked a definitive break from centuries of tradition and signaled the end of the shared governance I valued so deeply. The concentration of power in a single individual threatened to destroy the liberty we all cherished. Many senators feared that the old order could no longer function under the weight of one man's will. We believed that the assassination of Julius Caesar was a necessary act to preserve the Roman Republic from tyranny. The conspiracy grew quietly among men who felt that the Constitution had lost its power to protect us. I joined with Gaius Cassius and other senators to plan the removal of Caesar from the political scene. Our actions were driven by a deep conviction that the Republic required immediate and decisive intervention to survive. The assassination took place in the theater of Pompey, where he was surrounded by his enemies on the Ides of March. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the shouting that had come before. Following the death of Caesar, the political situation in Rome became even more volatile and uncertain for all involved. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyalist, quickly moved to seize control of the government and the state's resources. He consolidated his power over the Senate and the people with a speed that left us breathless. Brutus and Cassius found themselves marginalized in the capital as the new regime tightened its grip. We eventually left Rome to raise the eastern provinces of the empire in rebellion against the new order. The Senate granted us command against Mark Antony after he besieged us at Mutina. This military appointment reflected the complex political alliances that formed in the chaotic years after the Ides of March. We sought to establish a secure base from which to defend the ideals we held dear. The journey east was long and filled with the quiet hum of marching boots on dusty roads. We raised legions in the provinces, hoping to restore the balance of power that had been lost. The sun dipped low over the marble colonnades of a quiet Roman villa, casting long, soft shadows across the polished stone floor. A single oil lamp flickered gently on a wooden table, its flame dancing in the still air. The scent of dried lavender and old parchment filled the room, creating a sense of profound peace. Outside, the cicadas hummed a steady, rhythmic song that seemed to slow the very passage of time. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of light that filtered through the open shutters. A bronze bust of a stern statesman stood in the corner, its features softened by the dim illumination. The silence was deep and heavy, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the garden. This quiet space offered a sanctuary from the turmoil of the world outside, inviting the mind to rest. The cool stone walls held the warmth of the day, providing a comforting embrace for the weary traveler. Historical accounts of our actions vary widely depending on the perspective of the writer and the era in which they lived. Some ancient authors portrayed me as a noble hero who sacrificed his life for the freedom of his country. Others depicted me as a treacherous murderer who destroyed the stability of the Roman state. The truth lies somewhere in the quiet space between these two extremes. My legacy remains a subject of intense study in universities and research institutions around the world. The story of Brutus serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of political extremism. It also highlights the difficulty of maintaining republican ideals in a changing world. My name has been invoked by revolutionaries and reformers throughout history as a symbol of resistance. The figure of Brutus appears frequently in literature, art, and political discourse for centuries after my death. I represent the eternal struggle between individual conscience and the demands of the state. My life reminds us that the path of principle is often fraught with peril and uncertainty. The memory of my actions continues to inspire reflection on the nature of justice and power. Scholars analyze my decisions with great care, seeking to understand the full context of my choices. The complexity of my character ensures that I will never be fully forgotten by history. My story is a testament to the enduring power of human ideals and the cost of pursuing them. The legacy of Brutus endures as a powerful reminder of the fragility of political freedom. It challenges each generation to consider what they would do in similar circumstances. The quiet contemplation of my life offers a moment of peace amidst the noise of modern existence. The war that followed the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE led to the final destruction of those who favored the old republican constitution of Rome. This conflict effectively ended the hopes of restoring the traditional balance of power within the state. I became a symbol of republican values due to my opposition to Caesar's supreme power. My actions were viewed by some as a necessary defense of liberty against tyranny. Yet others saw my deeds as a tragic betrayal of a beloved leader. After I left Rome to occupy Cisalpine Gaul, which had been assigned to me by Caesar, I sought to establish a secure base from which to defend the ideals I held dear. My soldiers deserted me for Octavian while I was pursuing Antony into Gallia Narbonensis. This loss of support signaled the inevitable collapse of my cause and the rise of imperial rule. The Battle of Philippi sealed the fate of the Republican faction and their leader. The sun dipped low over the marble colonnades of a quiet Roman villa, casting long, soft shadows across the polished stone floor. A single oil lamp flickered gently on a wooden table, its flame dancing in the still air. The scent of dried lavender and old parchment filled the room, creating a sense of profound peace. Outside, the cicadas hummed a steady, rhythmic song that seemed to slow the very passage of time. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of light that filtered through the open shutters. A bronze bust of a stern statesman stood in the corner, its features softened by the dim illumination. The silence was deep and heavy, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the garden. This quiet space offered a sanctuary from the turmoil of the world outside, inviting the mind to rest. The cool stone walls held the warmth of the day, providing a comforting embrace for the weary traveler. The camps of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BC were vast and filled with the tension of an approaching storm. The landscape stretched out in shades of green and gold under the late afternoon sun, calm and undisturbed by the coming conflict. The air inside the tent smelled faintly of parchment and dried herbs, a scent that had lingered there for decades. Shadows lengthened across the floor as the sun began to set, casting long, gentle lines that moved slowly with the passing of time. No sound disturbed the peace of this place except for the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze that drifted through the open window. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final moments of a life that had been dedicated to the ideals of liberty and justice. Even in death, the memory of Brutus remained as steady and unchanging as the stone walls that surrounded him. The quiet atmosphere of the room offered a sense of closure to the turbulent events that had defined my final years. It was a place of reflection where the weight of history could be felt without the noise of conflict or the chaos of war. The stillness of the space allowed the mind to wander back to the days of youth and the hopes that had once filled the heart with purpose. In this calm setting, the story of Brutus found its natural end, wrapped in the silence of the evening and the soft light of the fading day. The final battle was fought on the plains of Philippi, where the dust of centuries settled over the fallen. The legions clashed with a ferocity that shook the earth. Yet the outcome was already written in the stars. My soldiers fought with courage, but the tide of history had turned against the old ways. I saw the lines break and the colors fall, a slow and quiet surrender to the inevitable. The weight, the dust settles slowly on the shelves where letters once lay open to the evening light. A woman named Johanna held the heavy burden of a brother's silence and a brother's pain. She gathered the scattered canvases that had been left behind in quiet attics and damp cellars. Her hands moved with a gentle certainty, folding the past into a new shape for the world to see. She spoke of a brother who saw colors no one else could name, who heard music in the rustling of wheat fields. The paintings were not merely objects of wood and oil, but vessels of a burning spirit that refused to fade. She traveled from city to city, from Amsterdam to Paris, carrying these heavy frames in her arms. Her voice was soft but unyielding as she told the story of a man who loved too deeply for his own good. The art dealers looked at the swirling skies and the bright, impossible suns with confusion in their eyes. They saw only madness in the thick layers of paint and the jagged lines of the cypress trees. She saw a soul that had reached out to touch the very fabric of existence. Her conviction was a quiet fire that warmed the cold rooms of museums and galleries. It was she who first understood that the blue of the night sky was not just a color, but a feeling of infinite longing. The world began to listen, slowly at first, then with a growing hunger for what she had to show them. The expressionists found their voice in the bold strokes she had championed so fiercely. They saw how the pain of a single man could become a universal language of the human heart. The Fauvists took her lessons and ran with them, painting with colors that screamed of life and death. The rigid rules of the academy crumbled under the weight of this new, raw vision. It was a slow awakening, like the sun rising over a frozen landscape, but it was certain and absolute. The paintings moved from the edges of society to the very center of the cultural conversation. They hung in grand halls where people walked in silence, their faces turned toward the starry nights and the sunflowers. The silence in those rooms was different now, filled with the echo of a life fully lived and fully felt. The stone does not speak, but the colors do, singing a song that never ends. A small ceramic bowl sits on a wooden table near the window, its surface glazed in a deep matte blue. The rim is slightly uneven, showing the touch of a hand that shaped it with care and patience. Inside the bowl, a few dried lavender sprigs rest. Their purple heads faded to a soft gray. The light from the window falls across the curve of the ceramic, creating a soft highlight that moves with the passing clouds. The texture of the wood beneath is rough and grainy, worn smooth by years of use. A faint scent of dried herbs and old dust hangs in the still air of the room. The silence here is deep and heavy, broken only by the distant chirping of a bird outside. The bowl holds nothing but the memory of what was once placed within it. It is a simple object, yet it seems to contain the weight of all the stories that have passed through this house. The blue glaze is deep and endless, like the sky on a clear winter day. Shadows lengthen across the table as the afternoon wears on, stretching the form of the bowl into a long, dark shape. The air feels cool and dry, inviting a deep and restful contemplation of the quiet moments. The bowl remains a silent witness to the passage of time, unchanged by the rush of the world outside. It is a place of rest, a small sanctuary within the larger flow of life. The light shifts imperceptibly, revealing new details in the rough texture of the wood. The scene is one of absolute peace, where nothing is demanded and nothing is expected. The bowl sits there, holding its place in the quiet room, a testament to the beauty of simple things. The influence of the paintings spread like a slow river, touching lands and minds far beyond the place of their creation. The blue period gave way to the golden years, each phase a different note in a long and complex melody. People began to see the world through eyes that had learned to look deeper than the surface. The rigid forms of the past were broken, replaced by the fluid and emotional lines of the new age. The legacy was not built on the words of a single man, but on the silent power of his vision. It was a legacy of color and light, of shadow and form, of pain and hope intertwined. The museums in Paris and New York and London became the new temples of this strange and beautiful faith. Pilgrims from all over the world came to stand before the canvases and feel the pulse of a life long gone. They walked slowly through the galleries, their footsteps soft on the polished floors. They stopped to look at the swirling stars and the bright, burning suns, feeling a connection that transcended time. The woman who had saved these works from oblivion had given them a second life, a life that would never end. Her name is often forgotten now, but her work remains in every brushstroke and every color choice. The art world changed forever because she refused to let the story die. The silence of the museums is a living silence, filled with the voices of millions who have seen the truth in the paint. The paintings are no longer just images, but windows into a soul that refused to be silenced. They hang on the walls like guardians, watching over the world with their wide, unblinking eyes. The legacy is complete, a circle closed and opened again in the endless cycle of art and memory. The stone does not crumble, and the colors do not fade, for they are held in the hearts of those who see them. The world is different now, colored by the vision of a man who saw the light in the darkness. The paintings remain, a quiet testament to the power of a single life to change the course of history. The silence